2022 is almost upon us, and with it, coming in February, is the launch of Total War Warhammer 3. But for many years now, starting in 2016, we've had Total War Warhammer. It came out with 4 original races, and the Chaos Warriors as the pre-order bonus, and then we got Game 2, and of course there was DLC for both. There are now a lot of factions, a lot of units, and the way that we've seen the game develop in terms of the complexity of the DLC and the faction mechanics has definitely evolved over time, leaving some factions in a better spot than others, quite frankly. And I figure, as we're coming into 2022 and it's January, you're soon to get a boring State of the Union address if you live in the United States, and I figured, how about something a lot more fun? How about a State of the Faction address, but for every faction in Total War Warhammer 2, and then of course we can maybe address this further after Game 3 comes out. So, where do all the factions stand going into Game 3? Are they in good shape? How are their campaign starts? How are their campaign mechanics? What does their battle roster look like? And are they missing anything? How do they play in battle in the campaign and in multiplayer? Folks, we're going to be answering all these questions, talking through the factions. Make sure you stick around. We're going to start with the Dwarves, because although they don't alphabetically come before Chaos, they do come before Warriors of Chaos, and they're going to be the first faction I cover. So let's jump right in to the Dwarves. Let's start things off by taking a look at their campaign start positions. Now, as of a recent DLC, Thorek Ironbrow can now represent the Dwarves in the Vortex campaign, so the Dwarves taking part of the narrative-driven campaign, part of Warhammer 2, and it gives them an interesting start position in the mountains of Lustria, which creates a lot of fun gameplay. You run into a lot of factions like Lizardmen, there are Tomb Kings nearby, there are Druki nearby, there are Skaven nearby, so lots of fun stuff to fight, and Thorek, a particularly fun lord. So in terms of being added into the narrative campaign, that was a cool addition from CA, getting to see that Game 1 faction join in the fun. And as far as Mortal Empires go, scroll over here to our stunted brethren. Thorgrim and Brindle still share a start position, which is a little bit sad, because other than that, all of the Dwarves do have a unique start position, which I think starts to bring them up to the standard that we've come to expect. Seeing all of the factions, especially later in the development process for Warhammer 2, but nonetheless, the start in the Silver Road is very interesting, and Thorgrim does play very different from Brindle, so at least you do have that. You are going to be fighting greenskins for days in both of those starts. And then we have Bellagar, who's starting over in the Vaults. Again, another interesting, unique gameplay because he's driven to go capture Karak 8 Peaks, and he has the ethereal heroes that follow and help his faction. Ungrim starting further north near Peak Pass, and Karak Kadrin, his Slayer-focused armies, end up facing off against undead and chaos very frequently in the campaign, which again creates a bit of a unique feel to it. Although I would say that in terms of the excitement, Thorek and Brindle are both a lot more exciting, just in terms of the way they play than, say, Bellagar or Ungrim, but still, they get their own unique starts and have some enjoyable gameplay. And then, of course, Thorek in this campaign is still going to be starting in a unique position. This time, though, he's going to be in the southeast of the map, starting in, I forget what they call this continent in Warhammer. It's south of the Badlands, essentially. So it's near the World's Edge Mountains here. So it's going to be a fun start. So interesting that you get to try him out in Lustria in the Vortex, and you get to try him out in the Southlands, or whatever they call this continent. The other. So unique starts, yes. It would be cool to see Brindle get a unique start position somewhere. Something interesting maybe in Game 3. And who knows, maybe we'll see more from the Dwarves in campaign. But so they added the Forge mechanic, where you can use Oath Gold to craft all kinds of awesome items for the Dawi. You can recycle other items. This creates an interesting dynamic for the Dwarves. They also added the character runes and the unit runes, and I think that, honestly, this puts the Dwarves in a pretty good position campaign-wise, especially for a Game 1 faction that hasn't had quite as major of an overhaul as some of the others. So I think the Dwarves overall in campaign are in a pretty solid place going into Game 3, and finish Game 2 in a strong place, still offering lots of fun gameplay to any players who are interested. Now, let's take a look at their roster, talk a little bit about their army, and how do their armies stand up both in single player and also in multiplayer. The Dwarf roster is quite a bit different than basically any other faction out there in Total War Warhammer 2, at least in my opinion. And one of the biggest differences you have is that there's really not a monstrous single entity unit like almost every faction enjoys, and so it makes the Dwarves a little bit unique in that. However, what the Dwarves lack in single entity monsters, they make up for in terms of armor and leadership. The Dwarves are a very defensive focused faction in terms of the way they play on the battlefield. Almost all of their units boast very high armor, with maybe just a few exceptions of like Rangers and Slayers, who don't have the same armor level, of course, but have their own unique features. But yeah, armor is high, leadership is high, and typically defense is high. Where the Dwarves will not be so good is in melee offense. The Dwarves really just not great. There are some units that have some decent statistics in terms of offense, like Hammerers. Their melee attack is pretty sound and their damage is pretty sound, but for whatever reason, they just don't seem to dish out very well. Maybe it's an issue with attack intervals or with their animations or something. I don't know what it is, but Hammerers have never quite seemed to stack up with their cost and their performance, so it's an odd one for me. But for the most part, you're not really going to see the offensive power of the Dwarves coming from their infantry. What you're going to be doing with their infantry is setting up a solid iron wall that is typically well shielded and well armored. It is good for slowing down enemies. It does not rout easily in the face of terror or fear like some armies can, and they can usually fight down pretty low in numbers, especially units like Longbeards and Ironbreakers. And then, of course, you have Slayers who can help guard the back lines as well, giving a completely unbreakable unit, meaning that they have to be killed at the very last. And with two varieties of Slayers, they are pretty potent. So as far as infantry goes, the Dwarves are difficult to break, albeit they don't have a lot of offensive power. Now, they make up for that lack of offensive power when they step into the realm of missile infantry. When it comes to missile infantry, the Dwarves are some of the best in the game. I don't think I would go as far as to say they are the best, but they are quite good. In terms of missile infantry, they have a lot of flexibility. Rangers provide a nice non-AP unit that has Vanguard deployment with the ability to stalk and move around the map with surprise. This gives them some interesting facets both in campaign and in multiplayer. Quarrelers providing a nice, well-rounded, shielded skirmisher unit, which will trade very well with almost any other skirmisher unit in the game and has nice range at 160. The Great Weapon variant provides you the ability to swap out that shield for a little extra hitting power, making these interesting units to have on the flank of an army, especially early in a campaign, when their melee stats aren't quite as easy to overcome for lower tier infantry or cavalry. You got Rangers with Great Weapons, which provide, again, a very interesting experience for the Dwarves. Very limited range, but they have the ability to absolutely hack through cavalry and monsters as long as they can be kept safe, get someone close. Iron Drakes bringing in, again, the ability to just absolutely delete unarmored blobs, and quite frankly, even if a unit is well armored, it won't be long before the Iron Drakes burn through them. They are very limited in range and line of sight, but if you get these characters in the right position, they will more than make up for the lack of offense from the infantry. Thunderers coming in with a nice AP ranged unit. Pretty decent range. It's not short range, it's not terribly long range, but excellent for chipping away at single entity monsters. They do struggle with the line of fire issues that all gun units do, and so they typically operate well when interlaced with something like the Quarrelers or Rangers, but a fantastic unit to have in the roster nonetheless. Bugman's Rangers providing a Ranger variant that can heal and is a little bit better in melee. They're also immune to psychology, so it provides an interesting trade-off there. And then finally, the Iron Drakes with Trollhammer torpedoes, providing the ultimate anti-large counter, assuming you can get those large units to be still, which with the new rune magic system, you certainly can. And we'll get back to that in a minute. We'll talk Lords and Heroes in just a moment. Flying, the gyrocopters are still there. Gyrocopters are good. They provide some different benefits depending on whether you're playing campaign or multiplayer. So it is basically the only speed in the Dwarf roster. They are very important units to the Dwarf roster. Without gyrocopters, Dwarves would probably be complete crap, in my opinion, just because they have no way to move around the battlefield quickly. You can play the Dwarves without the gyrocopters, but I do think the gyrocopters add an extremely important element of mobility to the Dwarf army, which is understandably extremely lacking for these slow, natural sprinters, though. Artillery and war machines, the Dwarf artillery is fantastic. In particular, I would call out the Grudge Thrower and the cannons. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on every unit here, but the cannons hit very hard, nice AP damage from very long range, and are pretty accurate at a relatively low cost. And then the Grudge Throwers are really good against blobs of infantry from long range as well, so the ability to hurt other artillery, hurt other skirmishers, infantry blobs, whereas the cannons come in and really mow down cavalry and single entity monsters. Now, that's not where the Dwarves' abilities end. Obviously, the Organ Gun is fantastic at mopping up armored infantry blobs. Medium range artillery, though, so its range is down to 300. Also pretty good against single entities, whereas the Flame Cannon is the ultimate infantry mop, though it's expensive and slow moving. However, it will hit like a truck when you get it into infantry. Now let's go back and let's talk a little bit about lords and heroes for the Dwarves and what they offer to the faction and how they play in. Now, the Master Engineer doesn't always get a ton of love. I find this character to be extremely helpful as a hero, especially in the campaign where you can buff the number of restocks that he can offer to the army. Dwarves thrive on their ability to cause missile damage, and the Master Engineer can help you continue to dish out that damage by handing more ammunition to your troops. So, in my opinion, the Master Engineer is a must-have for any Dawi player who is focusing on the ranged fire, and I think every Dawi player should be somewhat focused on ranged fire. So I love the Master Engineer, a very important add, and I love what they did with the Master Engineer, the most recent updates in terms of their skill tree, being able to go down a short-range Grudge Raker path or a long-range kind of sniper path. So really cool how they brought the Master Engineer up to snuff, and I find it to be a very useful unit. The Thane, also a decent unit. When you look at the Dwarves rosters, they are lacking those single entity monsters. Now, while the Thane isn't a monster, he is very well armored and shielded and has pretty solid leadership, so the Thane kind of becomes the go-to for the Dwarves as far as creating a blob, and they are quite good at it. You can get a couple of Thanes, place them in an army, stick them slightly out in front of your infantry line, and they can blob enemy units, or units like Iron Breakers, or Iron Drakes, Quarrelers, Thunderers, anything that you need to be able to hit a blob. Thanes become very useful for that, and I find that to be probably their best purpose, though these guys can be nice support, especially for Rune Lords and Runesmiths, who aren't quite as melee capable. So an interesting hero addition, albeit a little bit bland maybe in flavor, still very important to the Dawi roster. Felix, of course, is available if you have the DLC, and he can heal nearby units with his ability here, Blood Oath, which means that he can be quite helpful, although he is a bit squishy, and he's a human, so maybe we really shouldn't be including him here. We do have the Runesmith. Runesmiths, I love the recent change to rune magic. The only gripe that I have about rune magic is that I think its cooldowns are a little too long. Rune magic is already a little weak compared to a lot of lores of magic in terms of its ability to just cause direct damage. However, rune magic is quite good in its support abilities like adding attack, and with the rune of speed, and then also being able to add the rune of slowness here, which is a big deal indeed, because it can really slow down key units and give your dwarves a time to kill them. The Runesmith is, in my opinion, again, another very essential character in any dwarf army. If you're in a campaign, I suggest you have one in every stack, so long as they are available. And in multiplayer, I think a lot of people are going to make use of them as well. Gotrek, of course, kind of a unique Slayer hero that you get to add here. Very good against large, causes massive damage, and he's going to be good at taking down monsters. So if especially you combine him with like the Rune of Slowness, Gotrek can be an excellent tool for bringing down those monsters that so plague dwarf armies. Now, in terms of lords, you only get access to 2 generic lords. You can either have the Lord, which very creative there, not even Dwarf Lord, just Lord. Well done, CA. Then we have a Rune Lord. I think the Rune Lord is the better of the 2 generics. because of the rune magic. However, he's going to be quite weak in melee, albeit well armored. If you need a little bit better melee and you're not worried about the rune magic because maybe you brought a Runesmith already, then the Dwarf Lord is okay. They can hold their own, and they can be used kind of like a Thane when it comes to combat to get in the way and hold up enemy units, maybe create those blobs, although you will want to be careful with them. Now, when it comes to Legendary Lords, Bellagar is a tank. He can hold out in a fight for a long time, very well shielded, high armor, very good melee defense, very decent melee attack and weapon strength, just not specifically AP. So Bellagar is a pretty potent force in terms of being able to hold out in a fight for a long time. Brindle is really the dwarves' big damage dealer when it comes to combat, especially in the campaign where you can really rank up his stats. In the campaign, when you get this guy ranked up and up, he can just sit there and go toe-to-toe with folks like Grimgor and others. He is a monster in melee, and he is pretty darn good in multiplayer as well in terms of the melee damage that he dishes out. Very nice charge bonus for a dwarf, and he's got really good weapon damage with high AP and magic attacks as well. He's unbreakable, so Brindle is a force to be reckoned with in melee. Thorgrim is a lord that CA just can't seem to get him right. Like, he was pretty decent, and then they nerfed him, and now he's just irritating. He does have some abilities. I'll talk about these real quick. Thorgrim is broken, in my opinion, and needs to be fixed because he's just not very usable. He's extremely slow. He's an easy target for enemy missiles or monsters, and he doesn't really pay off, and I'll talk about why. If you look at the High King ability here, when you look at it, you're like, hey, this is pretty interesting. It's map-wide. It affects all allies. They get 8 melee attack. Basically, they get Frenzy, right? They get 8 melee attacks. So, hey, this is great. Well, only if their hit points are under 50%. So after your army's half dead, then they're inspired by the High King. Then they're inspired. So once they're half dead, then they decide, hey, maybe we should fight harder for the king in our presence. This is dumb. This needs to be changed. I mean, honestly, I feel like that this ability with Thorgrim should just be active, period, with the dwarves. Like, I don't think there should be a hit point limit on this. I think it should just be active, period, because Thorgrim is slow. He's not particularly fantastic in a melee, and he is an easy target. And so by using him, yeah, I think you should get to buff the melee of all the units on the battlefield. And that should be his benefit. You're taking a risk by bringing in a mobile lord who is somewhat easy to stop and hunt down, but you get the benefit of being able to throw in all that damage. So I think the High King ability needs to be changed to where it's just map-wide with no disabled if. It just is map-wide, and that's the way it functions. That's my opinion on that. If you disagree, please feel free to let me know. But if they did that, I feel like Thorgrim would be great. In his current state, I feel like Thorgrim is really only fun in campaign, where you can make him worthwhile, because in multiplayer, he's just too easy of a target. Now, Thorek Ironbrow, a cool addition to the game as well, a specialty Rune Lord who has AP damage, which makes him kind of a nice hybrid between a Dwarf Lord and then also a just the standard Runesmith. So he gets very nice magic, and he has these runes that are quite good. He can use them to great effect. Again, a little bit slow on cooldowns, in my opinion, on the magic for the Rune Lords, but otherwise still a very nice touch. And I think Thorek is a nice addition to the Legendary Lords, and he is a good one. He's quite a good Legendary Lord, and I think you'll see him fairly frequently. People are going to like him in campaign because of the buffs he comes with, and then in multiplayer, I'm sure he could be viable if you decide to put your rune magic on your Lord there. So definitely good stuff. So anyway, overall, that's the Dwarf roster. Let's talk about how they stack up in campaign and how they stack up in multiplayer. We'll start with campaign. In the campaign, the Dwarves are a very decent faction. Early on, I think the Dwarves are an excellent faction. Their armor is difficult for most factions to penetrate early in the game. Although you will be outnumbered massively in a lot of places, the Dwarves can usually make up for it with that armor and leadership. So I think in the early campaign, they stack up very well. When you look at the later campaign, some of their infantry will definitely struggle at that point. When you start running into Harganeth Executioners, Sword Masters, Black Orcs, all these other big-time, hard-hitting infantry, the Dwarves will start to wane in their capability to take that stuff head-to-head. However, what you will have by that point is access to fantastic artillery and missiles, and you should be able to make up the difference. So in the campaign, I think the Dwarves stand on their own 2 feet just fine in terms of their army roster, And then when you add in the fact that ogres are now in the campaign, so if I turn off this unit caps, and you now get access to some monstrous infantry and cavalry, honestly, the dwarves are in a pretty darn good place. Mournfang cavalry is just great for the dwarves in campaign, gives them the ability to hit hard and be mobile. And so I feel like that the dwarves do just fine in campaign. They really don't have any issues. I still feel like they could use a couple extra units in their rosters, but I mean, overall, really no complaints. I think the dwarves hold up just fine as a Game 1 faction heading into Game 3. Now, in terms of multiplayer, they require quite a bit of skill to play. They're not going to be all right for just your average Joe player like me, unless you're just playing social matches. If you're wanting to get competitive, then playing the dwarves is going to take some skill. You have to be good at picking your armies. You have to be good at microing those armies and knowing how to play against the factions you come up against. People are going to love to SEM spam you and chariot spam you, and you are going to have to be good at stopping it, or else they will cheese you to death and kind of make a fool out of you. So I would say that in terms of multiplayer, the dwarves are probably more of a mid-tier or lower-tier faction just because of their difficulty to use. However, it's partly just because of the way they play. Again, if you put them in the hands of a skilled player, they can be very challenging to defeat, especially for a player like myself who is of a much more moderate or average skill level. So I think it just depends on your skill level. If your skill level's up there, I think you're probably going to be okay with the state of the dwarves, even though a lot of people don't really love them in multiplayer. But if you're an average player like me, you're going to feel like they're pretty lackluster in multiplayer because they're just more difficult to use. Again, I think a lot of that has to do with skill level. Anyway, that's my rundown on the dwarves. I hope you enjoyed it. That's the state of the dwarves in Warhammer 2. Honestly, I think their state is pretty great, especially considering they're a Game 1 faction. I think the dwarves are in a pretty solid shape headed into Game 3, and they should still be a very fun faction to play when that becomes available in Game 3 on the larger campaign mode. Hey, make sure and get down there in the comments. Tell me what you think. Did I get it right? Did I get it wrong? What did I miss? And then, of course, guess what? If we did the dwarves today, well, we're going to keep the other factions coming. We're going to start with all the Game 1 factions, talk our way through all Game 1 factions, then we'll move on to the Game 2 factions. So all throughout January, it's the state of the faction, and I'll be bringing you more of that. Way more exciting than that horrible State of the Union address that we all have to listen to every year. Anyway, HeirofCarthage, signing out for now. I will see you soon with some more content in Total War Warhammer.